So in wrapping up this section on loops, I want to make one more warning about infinite loops. Infinite loops are common logical errors. What you want to make sure is that if you're using a while or a do while, that somewhere in the body of that loop, that condition is going to become false. And if you're using a for loop, you want to make sure that that update section is eventually going to make the condition false. Okay, so again, infinite loops are kind of an easy error to make. They happen a lot, but just want to be really careful to try to avoid them because they're pretty nasty little errors. Now, again, as a reminder, when to use which, if you know how many times you want to repeat code, then a for loop is a good choice. If you want to keep repeating code until something happens, including until the user takes some sort of action, then a do while or a while is a good choice. Now, all of these loops can be nested, so you can have one loop nested inside another loop. So you can have an outer loop and an inner loop. If we nest loops, then the number of times that code inside the inner loop will execute is outer times inner. So the number of times the outer loop will execute times the number of times the inner loop will execute. Because essentially, for each single iteration of the outer loop, the inner loop does a full cycle of its total number of iterations. So let's take a look at an example. Here we have nested while loops. So we have an outer while loop and an inner while loop. So the question is, how many times will this print line execute? Well, how many times does the outer loop execute? It executes count 1 is initialized to 1, and it's going to go, the outer while loop is going to initialize while count is less than or equal to 10. So that's what? That is 10 times. And how many times is the inner while loop going to execute? Well, the inner while loop is controlled by the variable count2, which is initialized to 1. And the inner while loop will go, well, count2 is less than or equal to 20, which is 20 times. So here will be printed 10 times 20 times, which is 200 times. Again, well, the outer loop goes through one cycle, so this is, well, count 1 is 1. The inner while loop will go through 20 times. So it'll print here 20 times. And then count 1 gets incremented to 2, and we go through another 20 times. And then count 1 gets incremented to 3, and we go through another 20 times, and so on and so on. So for each single pass of the outer loop, the inner nested loop does a full cycle of running through. Let's take a look at this example. So here we have, again, similar, but now our outer and inner while loops are controlled by just less than signs rather than less than or equal to. So how many times will the outer loop execute? 9. And how many times will the inner loop execute? 19. So that means here will be printed 9 times 19 times. I'll leave that math to you. Here's another example. We have an outer loop and an inner loop. And then afterwards we have a print line saying how many times the outer loop executed and how many times the inner loop executed. So what will be printed by this print line? Well, this is actually a trick question because notice that count 2 is declared inside the outer loop, which means it's only accessible inside the outer loop, which means this will actually give you a compiler error. Count 1 can be accessed outside the loops because that variable is declared outside the loops, but count 2 is declared inside the outer loop, and so it cannot be accessed outside of that loop. Okay, here's some nested for loops. When you have nested for loops, as I had mentioned before, I is kind of your most common variable that we use for a for loop. If you have a nested for loop, the inner one is usually controlled by a variable called j. Again, those are just kind of, those are just conventions. They're not rules, but they're good to follow. So how many times does this outer for loop execute? 20, right? If I starts at 0 and it goes up to but not including 20, that would be 20 times, 0 to 19. And the inner loop executes 40. J starts at 0 and goes up to but not including 40. That's going to be 40 times. So here will be printed 800 times. Again, when I equals 0, this inner for loop is going to cycle through 40 times. And then we'll hit our update. I will be updated to 1. And again, this inner loop cycles through 40 times. And then I is updated to 2. And the inner for loop cycles through 40 times, etc., etc. So again, with one pass of the outer loop, the inner loop does a full completed cycle. Okay, so let's wrap up this section on loops with one final example. We're going to write a high-low guessing game, basically a game where we ask the user to guess a number that we have randomly picked. So I'm going to write a new class called HiLo game. Okay, so here we go. Welcome to HiLo. So we're going to pick a random number, ask the user to guess that number, and then we're going to tell them if they're too high, they're too low, and they're going to guess again. Okay? So this is obviously going to use a loop, and it's also going to use some conditionals. So the first thing we can do is let's pick our random number. So we'll get a random number generator. And we'll pick our random number. Now, if we want the user to guess, let's say between 1 and 100, how many choices is that? It's 100 choices. And we want the choices to go from 1 to 100, not from 0 to 99. So we need to shift the value up by 1. Okay, so now I'm going to have I'll generate my scanner. Okay, so I'm going to have a Boolean for whether or not the user has guessed. I'll say guess correct. And initially, it's false, right? Initially, the user hasn't guessed anything, so they haven't guessed correctly yet. And I'm going to use a while loop because I don't know how many guesses it's going to take the user to get the right answer, right? So I don't know in advance how many loops I need, how many iterations of the loop I need. So either a do while or a while is a good choice. Probably a do while would even be a better choice because we need the user to at least always make one guess. But I'm going to use a while loop just because it's my preference. And remember that you're always welcome to use either a while or a do while. So I'm going to say, well, the guess is not correct, right? So this is initially going to be true. So I'm going to loop while the guess is not correct. I could have made this variable guess incorrect or not yet guessed or something like that, but I'm going to make the variable called guess correct, and I'm going to loop while the guess is not correct. Okay, so while the guess is not correct, I'm going to tell the user, enter a guess. I'm going to read in the user guess. And now I need to evaluate it. So if the user guess equals the random number, then what do? Well, I can print out that you've got it. And I can also set the guess correct to true. That will essentially stop my loop. Otherwise, if the user guess is less than the random number, I can print out too low. And then I'm going to use an else because there's only one other option, the user guess being greater than the number. And because one of these three things has to be true, I'm going to go ahead and use an else, but I'm going to make note that this means the user guess is greater than the random number. And I'm going to print out too high. So this doesn't allow the user to exit in any other way. The only way out of this loop is to eventually guess the number. And so when they're all done, I'll say goodbye. Okay, so let's run our program here. Enter a guess. 50 is too high. Let's try 25, too low. 32, too high. 27, too high. 26, I've got it. Okay, now what if we want to allow the user to play multiple games? What we can do is we can nest our loop. So we want to keep our while loop here, which is looping over the user guesses of a single game. But if we want the user to be able to play multiple games, we need another loop. So I'm going to declare another Boolean, keep playing, which I will initialize to be true. And I'm going to loop while the user wants to keep playing. And I'm going to put this whole big loop inside. And I'm going to again use my Control-Shift-F to do my updating of my indenting for me. And you can now see that I have a nested loop. Now I chose to nest my while loops because I don't know how many times the user is going to want to play. So that's a good situation to use a while loop. And again, before I didn't know how many guesses it was going to take. So again, that's a good situation to use a while loop on the inner as well. Neither one of these ones, I know in advance how many times they're going to iterate. So neither one is a good candidate for a for loop. They're both good candidates for a while or for do while. Okay, so while the user wants to keep playing, we will run through a whole single round of the game like we just did. But now what we need to do is after they bust out of this loop, this inner loop, we need to ask them, do they want to play again? And maybe I'll say enter 1 to play again. Okay, and then I will read in the user choice. I could have them enter in yes or no, like I've done before. Also, that would work. And if user choice is 1, well, actually, if user choice is not 1, then keep playing will be set to false. And if they enter in 1, then they'll keep playing. If they enter in anything else, keep playing will be set to false. And I can still set my goodbye message outside the outer loop because I only want goodbye to print once they're totally done. Now, does anyone see any logical errors with the code as I have it written here? Well, let's play a game and see. Okay, enter a guess 50, that's too high, 25, too low, 32, too low, 44, too high, 40, too low, 42, too low, 43, and I've got it. Enter 1 to play again. Let's play again. 50. Goodbye. Oops, what did I do here? To play again. Somewhere there's an error here in my play again, so I hit 1. And the user choice was not equal to 1. Okay, there's an error here. Let me pause this while I figure out where my mistake was. Okay, so hopefully some of you spotted my mistake before I did. It wasn't even the logical question I was asking about, but it's another good logical question or error that I have going on here. So what is happening is I entered 1 to play again, which means I did not go into my if statement here, but I looped back around and kept on playing. And then it said, well, guess is not correct. But remember that because I guessed right the first time, guess correct was already set to true, right? So what I need to do is a couple of different things. I could make an else statement to say, okay, if the user doesn't enter a 1, or doesn't enter 1, meaning they want to quit, set keep playing to false. And I could put an else that says otherwise, reset the guess correct to false. Okay, that would be one option. Another option is I can just declare guess correct inside of my outer while loop instead of outside the loop. And then what that means is that when I get done with one iteration of this loop, all right, so here I go through my loop, I eventually guess it correctly. When I reach the end of my outer loop, guess correct will be garbage collected because it's local to that outer loop. And then when I loop back around, I'll redeclare it again and enter in. Okay, so either one of those approaches are good ones. I'm going to use this one because it kind of is a better structure, because really guess correct should be local just to one kind of round, right? You have a guess being correct or not for each round. And this outer loop, so the outer loop represents one round of the game, and the inner loop represents one guess within each round. Okay, so the inner loop is iterating over multiple guesses. The outer loop is iterating over multiple rounds. All right, so let's try this again. Enter a guess 50, too high, 25, too high, 12, too low, 18, I've got it. Let's play again. Enter a guess 50, too high, 25, too high, 12, too low, 18, I've got it. It was 18 again. If I play again and just enter 18, same number again. What's going on here? Well, where did I declare my random number? I declared it outside the outer loop. So my random number is going to be the same every time I play the game. That obviously makes for a pretty boring game. So let's take this line of code and move it inside the outer loop. Right? We don't want it inside the inner loop because then we'd be generating a new random number after every guess. That wouldn't be very good. But we want it inside the outer loop so that each time we play a new round, we get a new random number. Okay? So you got to think a little carefully. Obviously, you'll see I made a mistake in my first pass through. But when you're using nested loops, you got to think carefully about what should be declared where and what should be accessed where. Okay? All right, so here's an example of nesting loops, of using some conditionals and using some user input to know when to stop those loops.